Bienvenido al diario.es. La primera pregunta, ¿qué falló en el intento de Syriza de desafiar la política de austeridad de Europa?
We failed to renegotiate the spectacularly failed program that was being applied for 5-6 years in Greece before we were elected. There is a myth going around that Greece was recovering until we were elected. This is not true. The reason why we were elected was because Greece was constantly shrinking in terms of its economic energy and becoming more and more unviable. And we had a task of taking to Brussels and to Frankfurt the mandate from the Greek people to renegotiate that failed program. We presented to them extremely moderate ideas and proposals and policies. We had a level of technical competence which exceeded that of the troika, but the problem was that they were not interested in a serious discussion about Greece. The only thing they were interested was into crushing a government that dared challenge them, because they had other issues in mind, like for instance the Portuguese election, the Spanish election, the Irish election. It's very nasty 19th century-like power politics, where one nation is crushed in order to put the fear of God into another. A Europe that operates along those lines is a wounded Europe, a Europe that cannot deal with its very serious issues.
Esto es cierto que hubo una presión tremenda por parte de Europa para dar una lección con Grecia, pero ¿tenía una oportunidad Grecia de desafiar esas políticas? ¿Podía haber seguido adelante su plan de desafiar las políticas de la troika?
We certainly had a chance. We had a plan on how to convince the troika to negotiate with us. Let me be brutally honest with you. I knew, and the Prime Minister knew, because we discussed it many months before we won government, that the moment we challenged the troika, they would threaten to close down our banking system. And we had a twofold plan B, if you want, or a twofold reaction to such a brutal threat. First, if they closed down banks that the ECB, the European Central Bank, had deemed to be solvent only a few weeks before, and that would have been considered an enemy action, and it would give us every, if you want, justification immediately to default on the 27 billion of old Greek government bonds that the ECB had purchased in 2010-2011. That would have created a very serious problem for Mario Draghi. Why? Because the whole quantitative easing program, the issuing, the printing of 65 billion euros a month to keep the Eurozone together, it's the only thing that keeps the Eurozone together, would have serious legal issues if that 27 billion had been restructured unilaterally by us in response to a very aggressive act by the ECB. That was, if you want, the first fault. The second fault of our reaction, planned reaction, was to put into effect a parallel payment system, not a parallel currency, it's important to make the distinction, a parallel payment system, euro-denominated, using the tax system. This is a technical issue, but it would have allowed us a week or two within which to be able to have some liquidity in the Greek economy while there is a serious negotiation under the threat, on the one hand, their threat of bank closure and our threat of retaliating through the haircut of these bonds. Unfortunately, at the crucial moment, our cabinet, our war cabinet, our inner cabinet, voted against activating this strategy in response to the bank closures that so illicitly were used to asphyxiate us. At that moment, of course, we lost any chance of success.
Y ese día es el día en que usted presenta la dimisión. ¿Por qué cree que Alexis Tsipras, en el último momento, justo en el momento clave de esa negociación, cuando era todo o nada, decidió dar marcha atrás?
I don't believe it was all of a sudden. From April, I could see that there were signs of making compromises. I was all in favor of making compromises, but there are some compromises you don't make. For instance, you don't accept the levels of austerity that you know will crush your economy. So what was the point of getting elected? A 3.5% primary surplus. Against my judgment, against my recommendations, he accepted that from the troika. There was a steady decline I was still, however, you're quite right, hoping that the 62% of this magnificent, courageous act by the Greek people on the 5th of July would have energized my prime minister. When I realized it didn't happen, of course I resigned. But I'm not going to comment on why he changed course, because I don't believe that, especially those of us on the left, should indulge this tendency of projecting onto our comrades our own thinking of what they're thinking, and using this projection in order to call them names and start denouncing each other. The left has a very sad tradition of doing that. I'm not going to do that.
Okay. Hablaba antes de que tenían un plan que consistía en utilizar un sistema de pago basado en el sistema fiscal para evitar que se quedase sin liquidez la economía. ¿Estaba desarrollado ese sistema técnico para poder pasar esas 2 semanas mientras se negociaba con la troika?
There were 2 purposes. Firstly, as you said, to give us breathing room. I still remain convinced that if we had signaled to the ECB that we would haircut those S&P bonds, that they would not have shut the banks down. But then, of course, we needed, just in case this assessment was wrong, we needed a parallel payment system in order to give us 1 or 2 or 3 weeks of some liquidity in the Greek economy during negotiations after we had haircut or threatened to haircut those bonds. But there was another reason too. I believe that this idea of a parallel payment system using the tax office is one that we should have had anyway. Not just Greece, Spain, even France. It is a way of bringing together citizens and the state in a manner that does 2 things. Firstly, it extinguishes mutual obligations, liabilities that the state has towards its citizens or companies, and vice versa, and at the same time giving rise to a, if you want, a peer-to-peer system, as the Americans would say, by which to have the citizens lend money to the state at interest rates that they can never find in the commercial banks, and therefore allowing the state to have access to funding beyond the very sturdy and difficult bond markets.
Si ese sistema se hubiese puesto en marcha y hubiesen contado con esas 2 semanas, 3 semanas para presionar a la troika con la enorme deuda que podría asumir el Banco Central Europeo, ¿qué habría pasado después? ¿Habría sido una salida del euro? ¿Habría podido seguir adelante Grecia fuera del euro? ¿Era una opción que no contemplaban? ¿Era una opción que buscaban? ¿Cuál habría sido la salida posterior?
Oh, Greece has survived 400 years of the Ottoman Empire. We've survived the Nazis, we have survived the terrible civil wars. Greece is very hard to kill, so we would survive. The question is not whether we would survive, the question is how do we minimize the human cost of an unnecessary crisis? Because the crisis we've been having since 2010 is unnecessary. Maybe there had to be a correction, like capitalism goes through spasms, but this Great Depression, which is continuing year after year after year, is completely unnecessary. It's just a result of bad policy. Regarding Brexit, look, I lost a lot of friends in the 1990s because I was arguing against Greece entering the Eurozone. Actually, I was arguing against the Eurozone because it was a terrible architectural design. I don't have a problem with a common currency. So the dollar zone is fine for the states of the United States of America. But the way we designed the Eurozone, it was like asking for trouble. So I was a critic and I was an opponent to the Euro. But it's one thing to say we should not have created it. It's quite another to say we should disintegrate it. Because if we disintegrate it now, we're not going to go to where we would have been had we not created it. We are going to fall off a cliff. We're going to have a huge fault line running across the Rhine, the river, and the Alps. The northeastern part of Europe will have become a new Deutschmark zone. It will become very recessionary because that Deutschmark will go through the roof. And working poor Germans and Dutch people will become unemployed poor. This is not a good development. The rest of us are going to have high inflation because our currencies are going to devalue and high unemployment. We'll become a black hole for the global economy. For a third time in 100 years, we will have destabilized the world and our economies and our societies. Who's going to benefit from that? The fascists, the ultranationalists, all those bad, evil forces that are conspiring as we speak in order to create a new 1930s. So this is why Brexit was never on my cards, On the other hand, having said that, I could to add an important nuance here. When I was being threatened with Grexit, I didn't fear it. It was not my policy. I never used this as if you want, a threat. But when they were saying, oh, if you don't accept a new loan and a new toxic reduction pension, because otherwise we'll throw you out of the Eurozone, I'd say, firstly, that would be illegal for you to do, because there's no provision for throwing somebody out of the Eurozone. And secondly, do your worst. History will pass harsh judgment on you, not on us.
En el año en que empezó todo para Grecia, cuando aflora toda la enorme deuda, ¿habría sido una opción la salida del euro, mejor que la que luego vino después, con todos los planes de rescate que consiguieron aumentar la deuda, crear más desempleo, crear más pobreza?
It was never the solution. But we didn't have to go through Grexit. Imagine if in January, February 2010, the Greek government of George Papandreou then went to Europe and said, folks, we're broke. You know what? We're going to default on our debt. Nothing about Grexit. We're going to default on our debt. At that moment, this is very important for our viewers and our audience to remember, to be reminded of. The Greek state owed nothing to taxpayers in Germany, in Slovakia, in Italy, in Spain, anywhere. Not €1. We owed money to the banks. Well, if I lend you 10 million euros because you asked me, and you can't repay me, I believe that 50% of the fault is mine and 50% of the fault is yours. So we both must suffer. So the Greek state would suffer if we had defaulted in January, February, March, April of 2010. And so would the banks. But it would be a short, sharp shock, and then we would have moved on. There's no reason why I should get out of the euro. The idea that if you default in the euro, you have to get out. Where is that written? Have you seen this anywhere in the Maastricht Treaty? You see, what happens is, those who insist on the rules do not respect them. Those who make a big fuss about, oh, the rules are the rules are the rules, are the ones that make them up. They create new ones when it suits them, and they do not respect the rules when it doesn't suit them to respect.
Ellos convirtieron una deuda privada en una deuda pública para salvar a los bancos alemanes, franceses.
Yes, indeed. It was a cynical transfer of losses from the books of the banks onto the shoulders, the weaker shoulders, of the Spanish people, the German people, the Greek people, the Italian people, and so on and so forth.
Usted antes ha citado la importancia de Portugal, Grecia, Portugal, España, Italia en la negociación de Grecia, el miedo de contagio de la troika. ¿Fue esa la clave de la presión sobre Grecia en la negociación con Europa?
There's no doubt that the number one priority, the moment we were elected, was to stop our election from yielding a government that succeeded. Their worst fear was our success. Because if we had succeeded in renegotiating our deal with Europe, with the troika, in a manner that made it more palatable and less harsh for the weakest of Greeks, then that would give ideas to the Portuguese who were voting next, to the Spanish who were coming out afterwards in December, to the Irish who are coming up now, to the French, maybe to some Germans. So yes, it was just pure, vulgar 19th century power politics. You crush X to instill fear in Y.